The most powerful man on earth picked up the phone and threatened the leader of a sovereign nation, not a rival superpower, not a nuclear adversary. Mexico, America's neighbor, its largest trading partner, a country of 130 million people. And Donald Trump told President Claudia Sheinbaum in no uncertain terms, capture El Mencho or we're coming in. Think about what that actually means. The United States government was prepared to violate the territorial sovereignty of another nation, a democratic nation, not because of an act of war, not because of a missile launch, but because of its own failure to control the demand side of a drug crisis it created. America produces the guns, America consumes the fentanyl, and yet the boots were threatening to march south. This is not foreign policy. This is imperial leverage dressed in the language of security. And the rest of the world is watching very, very carefully. And because if it can happen to Mexico today, the logic doesn't stop at the Rio Grande. Let's go back to the beginning of this story, because to understand what Trump did and why it matters so much more than the headlines are telling you, you have to understand who El Mencho actually is, what he represents, and why the United States government has been obsessed with him for years. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, that's his real name, but the world knows him as El Mencho, the founder and supreme leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, as it's known in intelligence circles. And this isn't just another cartel boss. This isn't Pablo Escobar repackaged for the 21st century. El Mencho represents something genuinely new and genuinely terrifying in the architecture of organized crime. He built an organization that doesn't just move drugs, it controls territory, it deploys military-grade weaponry, it shoots down Mexican military helicopters, and it has expanded its operational footprint to more than 30 countries. 30 countries, that's not a drug cartel, that's a non-state military power with a revenue model built on narcotics. The DEA has had a $10 million bounty on El Mencho's head for years, $10 million, and he's still out there, still operating, still commanding one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the history of the Western Hemisphere. And that tells you something critical, not about Mexico's incompetence, but about the sheer structural complexity of what the United States is asking another government to do, while simultaneously refusing to address the conditions inside its own borders that make El Mencho's business not just possible, but wildly profitable. Now let's talk about Claudia Sheinbaum, because she is not a puppet and she is not a pushover. And that's exactly why this confrontation became what it became. Sheinbaum is a climate scientist. She has a PhD. She was the mayor of Mexico City. She won the Mexican presidency in June of 2024 by the largest electoral margin in modern Mexican history. She is ideologically the inheritor of López Obrador's vision, a left nationalist project that puts Mexican sovereignty at the absolute center of everything. And when Trump called her or sent word through official channels, depending on which account you follow, the message was clear. Either Mexican authorities moved to capture El Mencho, or the United States was prepared to take unilateral military action inside Mexican territory. Now stop there for a second. Just stop and sit with that, because I want you to feel the weight of that sentence the way the rest of the world felt it. A sitting American president threatening to send military forces, special operations, drone strikes, whatever form that action might take, into a neighboring democratic country without its consent, without a declaration of war, without a United Nations resolution, without any legal framework whatsoever, just raw power, just the logic of empire saying, we are bigger, we are stronger, and if you don't do what we say, we will act as though your borders don't exist. And here's the thing that should alarm every single American who believes in the rule of law. This isn't entirely unprecedented in American history. This country has a long and documented record of violating the sovereignty of Latin American nations when it decided its interests demanded it. Guatemala in 1954, Cuba in 1961, Chile in 1973, Panama in 1989, These are not conspiracy theories. These are documented historical facts that live in declassified government records. So when Trump makes this kind of threat, he isn't inventing a new playbook. He is reaching back into a very old one. And the tragedy, the real tragedy, is that most Americans have never been taught this history in a way that helps them recognize when it's happening again in real time. But let me go deeper, because the surface level of this story, Trump threatens Mexico, Mexico pushes back, is actually the least interesting part. What's really happening here is a collision between two entirely different conceptions of what sovereignty means in the 21st century. And that collision is going to shape geopolitics for decades. On one side, you have the Trump administration's worldview, which is essentially this: sovereignty is something powerful nations have, and it is something weaker nations earn through compliance. Mexico wants a good trade relationship with the United States. Then Mexico does what Washington says. Mexico wants to avoid tariffs. Then Mexico performs on America's terms. This is not diplomacy. This is tribute. This is the logic of a patron-client relationship in which the junior partner has no genuine autonomy, only the appearance of it, granted conditionally, revocable at any moment. And Trump has never been subtle about this worldview. He has said it out loud, repeatedly, in terms that diplomatic language normally softens, but that he refuses to soften. He sees the world as a hierarchy of power, and he sees the United States at the top of that hierarchy with the right to make demands of everyone below it. On the other side, you have Sheinbaum's Mexico, which has staked its entire political identity on a different principle: the principle that sovereignty is not conditional, that no nation, regardless of its economic power, has the right to dictate terms to another nation as though it were a province rather than a country. And Sheinbaum didn't back down. She didn't capitulate. She responded publicly, on the record, with a clarity that was almost startling. She said, in effect, Mexico's territory is not for sale, and it is not negotiable. Mexican sovereignty is not a bargaining chip. We will cooperate on security where that cooperation is mutual and respectful, but we will not accept threats. We will not accept ultimatums, and we will not allow foreign military forces on our soil. Now think about what it takes for a Mexican president to say that to the President of the United States, given the economic reality Mexico lives inside every single day. 80% of Mexico's exports go to the United States. 80%. That's not a trade relationship. That's a structural dependency that gives Washington enormous leverage over virtually every major economic decision the Mexican government makes. Threatening that relationship, even implicitly, is not a small thing. It's an existential threat to the Mexican economy. And Sheinbaum said it anyway. She held the line. And that tells you something important about both the political moment in Mexico and the broader global mood around American power. Because Mexico is not alone in this posture. This is what the American media is consistently failing to explain to the American public, that the resistance to this kind of unilateral American pressure is no longer confined to traditional adversaries like Russia and China. It is spreading through the global south with a velocity and coherence that should be causing serious alarm in Washington if Washington were paying attention. Brazil under Lula, Colombia under Petro, Venezuela, obviously, Bolivia, even within regions historically aligned with the United States, you are seeing governments say openly and defiantly that the old terms of engagement are no longer acceptable, that the era of unconditional compliance is over, that sovereignty, real sovereignty, not the performed kind, is back on the table as a genuine political demand. And El Mencho sits right at the center of this entire geopolitical drama, almost like a character that a novelist would invent to make the contradictions of American foreign policy visible in a single human story. Because here is the fundamental absurdity that the Trump administration cannot explain its way out of. The United States is the largest consumer of illegal narcotics in the world. the largest, full stop. The demand that makes El Mencho's empire possible, the billions of dollars that flow from American streets and suburbs and rural communities into the coffers of the CJNG, that demand originates in the United States. The guns that arm El Mencho's soldiers, an estimated 70% of weapons seized from cartels in Mexico, are traced back to American manufacturers and American gun stores. 70%. That is not a Mexican problem that spilled over the border. That is an American problem that crossed the border going south. And yet the Trump administration's framing, and this is the framing that dominates American political conversation because it is never seriously challenged in mainstream media, is that this is entirely Mexico's failure, Mexico's corruption, Mexico's inability or unwillingness to control criminal organizations on its soil, as though the United States has no role in creating the conditions that make those criminal organizations as powerful and as profitable as they are, as though you could somehow surgically remove El Mencho from this equation and not immediately have another El Mencho and then another one after that, because the underlying economic logic that produces these organizations remains completely untouched. This is what Richard Nixon's war on drugs never solved. This is what Reagan's war on drugs never solved. This is what Plan Colombia, with all its billions of American dollars and military advisors and helicopter gunships, never solved, because none of those interventions ever addressed the demand side. None of them ever seriously grappled with why so many Americans are reaching for substances that cartels supply. The poverty, the despair, the mental health crisis, the collapse of community in deindustrialized regions, the opioid epidemic that was manufactured, let's be honest, largely by American pharmaceutical companies before it was inherited by Mexican fentanyl suppliers. These are American social pathologies, and the solution being offered by the Trump administration is to threaten a foreign president into capturing a cartel boss, as though that would somehow cauterize the wound. Let's also talk about what this threat reveals about the internal dynamics of the Trump administration's foreign policy, because there's a pattern here that goes well beyond Mexico, and it matters for understanding where American power is heading. Trump's approach to international relations is fundamentally transactional and fundamentally coercive. It doesn't build alliances, it builds leverage. It doesn't create partnerships, it creates dependencies and resentments. And the short-term wins that coercive diplomacy sometimes produces, a Mexican security operation here, a trade concession there, come at an enormous long-term cost that accountants of power don't always measure until it's too late. Think about what happens in Mexico after this threat becomes public. Every Mexican politician who wants to build a career on nationalist sentiment, and there are many of them, now has a gift handed to them by Washington. Every time a Mexican president wants to mobilize public support, they can point to this moment and say, this is how the Americans see us. This is what they think of our sovereignty. This is the relationship they want. And Mexican nationalism, which has deep historical roots going all the way back to the Mexican-American War of 1846 and the loss of nearly half of Mexico's territory to the United States, is not an abstract sentiment. It is alive. It is electoral. And every time Washington behaves like this, it feeds that nationalism in ways that ultimately make security cooperation harder, not easier. And let's not pretend that the drug war is the only context in which this dynamic is playing out, because simultaneously, while Trump was threatening Mexico over El Mencho, his administration was also deploying tariff threats, massive, sweeping tariff threats against Mexican goods as a separate instrument of coercion around immigration. The message to Mexico was essentially the same in both cases. Do what we say, or we will hurt you economically. And while that message is delivered with the confidence of a nation that still holds enormous economic leverage, it is also delivered in a world that is rapidly building alternatives to dollar-denominated trade, to American-led financial systems, and to the geopolitical structures that made that leverage so overwhelming for so long. China is building infrastructure across Latin America. Russia is deepening its relationships with governments that feel alienated from Washington. The BRICS alliance is expanding. The dollar's share of global reserve holdings is declining, slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably. And every time the United States treats a country like Mexico the way Trump's administration treats it, as a subordinate that exists to manage problems the United States created, it accelerates the process by which those countries begin looking for exits from American-dominated systems. This is not radical analysis. This is basic geopolitical logic that any serious student of international relations would recognize. Now, I want to come back to El Mencho himself for a moment, because there is something important here that gets lost in the political noise. El Mencho is, in many ways, a product of American policy. He was a former member of a Mexican rural police force, the kind of underpaid, under-resourced institution that exists in countries where the formal economy has never fully absorbed the rural poor. He migrated to California. He was arrested in the United States for heroin trafficking. He was deported. And then he built one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history. That biography, Migration, Deportation, Criminal Enterprise, is not unique to El Mencho. It is a recurring pattern in the history of organized crime along the US-Mexico border because it reflects a recurring structural reality. The formal economy keeps failing people, and the informal economy, the illegal economy, offers something the formal economy doesn't, which is a path to power and survival for those who have been systematically excluded. You can't threaten your way out of that reality. You can't drone strike your way out of that reality. You can arrest El Mencho tomorrow, and maybe one day they will. And within months, someone else will emerge to fill the vacuum, because the vacuum is not created by El Mencho's existence. The vacuum is created by the structural conditions that make his existence both possible and, from a certain brutal economic perspective, rational. This is what the war on drugs has never been able to confront honestly, because confronting it honestly would require the United States to look at itself, at its inequality, at its failed social policies, at the consequences of decades of deindustrialization and austerity, rather than looking south and pointing fingers. And Sheinbaum knows this. She has said as much. Her government's approach to organized crime has been to argue, controversially and not without real security costs, that you have to address the social conditions that make cartel recruitment possible, not just the military capacity of the cartels themselves. This is not naivete. This is actually the conclusion of most serious criminological research conducted over the last 30 years. But it is a conclusion that is politically inconvenient in Washington because it shifts the frame from Mexico's problem to a shared problem with shared causes, and that framing demands shared responsibility, which demands a kind of humility that the Trump administration is structurally incapable of. Let's zoom out even further, because this story is not just about Mexico and the United States. It is about a global realignment that is happening faster than most Americans realize, in part because American media is remarkably insular about explaining the world beyond its borders to its own citizens. The threat Trump made to Sheinbaum, the implicit suggestion that American military force could be deployed inside a sovereign nation's territory without consent, is being watched in capitals from Brasilia to Beijing to Riyadh to New Delhi. And what those capitals are calculating, each in their own way, is what it means to be in America's orbit right now. What does American partnership actually cost? What does American pressure actually feel like when it arrives? And is the benefit of proximity to American power worth the price that proximity now demands? These are not idle questions. They are the questions that are reshaping alliance structures, trade relationships, and strategic calculations all over the world in real time. And the answers that are emerging slowly, unevenly, but with increasing consistency are answers that should worry any American who understands that the United States' global influence depends not just on military and economic power, but on something softer and harder to quantify, which is the perception that America is a partner worth having rather than a threat worth managing. There is also a domestic American dimension to this story that deserves serious attention. Because the threat to Mexico, the deployment of military force framing, the macho posturing around El Mencho's capture is not primarily a foreign policy decision. It is a domestic political performance. It is designed to speak to a specific constituency inside the United States that wants to see a president who is tough, who doesn't ask permission, who treats American power as something to be wielded rather than apologized for. And that constituency is real, and its political power is real, and understanding why it exists tells you something important about where America is right now as a society. Because that constituency, the Americans who cheer when the president threatens Mexico, who want to see military action against cartels, who frame the drug crisis as an invasion rather than a domestic public health emergency, that constituency is not stupid. It is suffering. The communities most devastated by the fentanyl crisis are not abstract statistics. They are real towns, real families, real people who have watched their children die and their communities dissolve and their economic futures disappear. And when a politician comes along and offers them an enemy, a foreign enemy, a cartel boss with a menacing nickname, a foreign president who needs to be pressured into action, it is psychologically satisfying in a way that we need to invest in mental health infrastructure and address the root causes of addiction simply is not. The politics of the external threat is always easier than the politics of internal reckoning. But easier is not the same as true, and easier is not the same as effective. And the gap between the political performance and the actual policy outcome is where the American people keep getting hurt, decade after decade, administration after administration in this particular story. Because here is what will almost certainly happen. And I say this not as a prediction born of cynicism, but as an observation born of history. Either El Mencho will eventually be captured or killed, at which point the CJNG will reorganize under new leadership, the fentanyl will keep flowing, and the crisis will continue, or he won't be captured, and the Trump administration will either follow through on its threat, triggering a diplomatic catastrophe and a nationalist backlash in Mexico that makes security cooperation impossible for years, or it won't follow through, and the threat will be revealed as bluster, which will reduce American leverage in future negotiations, not just with Mexico, but with every government watching to see whether American threats have real consequences. There is no version of this story in which the coercive approach produces the outcome that the American people actually need. What the American people actually need is a government willing to have an honest conversation about addiction, about poverty, about the failures of the war on drugs, about the role of American gun manufacturers in arming criminal organizations across the border, about the role of American financial institutions in laundering cartel money. And yes, American banks have been caught doing exactly that repeatedly, with consequences so mild they barely register as deterrents. That honest conversation is not happening. It is not happening in Congress, it is not happening in the White House, and it is barely happening in the media. Instead, what is happening is a threat to a foreign president, a 10-second clip of American toughness, and the comfortable illusion that the problem lives south of the border. Sheinbaum held her ground, and in holding her ground, she did something that very few leaders in the American hemisphere are currently willing to do. She looked American power in the eye and said no, not because she is anti-American, not because she wants conflict, but because she understands something that Washington keeps refusing to understand, that a relationship built on coercion is not a relationship. It is a hostage situation, and hostage situations eventually always break down. The world is watching this. The global south is watching this. Future historians will look back at moments like this one, this phone call, this threat, this confrontation between a superpower and its neighbor as part of the larger story of how American hegemony either evolved into something more sustainable and more just, or continued down a path that accelerated its own unraveling. And the question that every American who cares about this country's future should be asking is not whether Trump was tough enough on Mexico. The question is whether being tough is the same as being right, whether power is the same as wisdom, whether threatening a sovereign nation's leader is a sign of strength or a sign that you've run out of better ideas. Because if it's the latter, then the problem isn't El Mencho, the problem is us.